Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 4 of the training program for tour guide training in Koshrai, Federated States of Micronesia, sponsored by the UNESCO Participation Program. And in this part, we're going to be looking at conservation area management and really how that ties into a lot of the visitor and guest perceptions of the MCA, as well as how the MCA was formed and how we think about the MCA. I'll also touch a little bit on some trail maintenance techniques here and ideas, as well as, again, safety, particularly for tour guides who are primarily leading guests into and out of the area and talking about natural and cultural history and contemporary life on Koshrai as well, rather than doing trail maintenance exclusively. So some key message is overall, this section is important because it lets us think about how visitors are thinking about natural resources and wilderness spaces in the conservation area. These ideas originated in the United States of America, and I'll talk about some of the history of that. And many of the guests from the United States and Europe will be familiar with these ideas, probably Australia as well. The model of park creation maintenance operations have global reach. So this idea of wilderness parks, many tourists will bring these perspectives to Koshrai, and understanding these will help you to create better experiences for those taking a tour with you. It also maybe help you to anticipate some of the questions that they might have. An important phrase to keep in mind for health is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Safety section, whereas a stitch in time saves 9. So care of the Mahkontowe Conservation Area means regular checkups and maintenance in order to make sure that visitors have high quality, safe, and memorable experiences that they will share with family, friends, and future visitors to Koshrai, maybe even themselves repeating a visit to Koshrai in the future. So in this section, with this part here, we're going to look at environmentalism overall and what that means in relation to how it was conceptualized along preservation and conservation lines in the United States. Talk a little bit about the science of ecology and how that started, the environmental movement in the United States, and its changes over time with law and policy that have arisen. We'll talk specifically about wilderness, the Wilderness Act in the United States, and here's where we really see the global reach, and we'll look at the implication of wilderness versus subsistence in one example. And then at the end, I'll just talk a little bit about trail maintenance and safety. So in the United States, you've got two main figures basically figuring out what's going on in the early 1900s. You have Gifford Pinchot, who's a Milford, Pennsylvania native, which is part of where I grew up. He has the multiple use sustained yields utilitarian, that basically nature exists for people. We should be utilizing it unapologetically, but we should be managing it wisely. For John Muir, on the other hand, he was about preserving what he called cathedrals. So these were his really sacred spaces that he really, really liked a whole bunch. We should be using everything else, but the cathedrals should be preserved and people should just be visitors in this area. And this becomes important as we're thinking about wilderness, and I'll get to that in a little bit. In terms of ecology and thinking about ecological systems, the term ecosystem is relatively recent. It was coined by Arthur Tansley. And this idea of climax communities really fallen out of favor in ecology, this idea of nature balancing and repairing itself. So early on, the way that ecological systems were thought about, they were actually thought about as computer circuits, and everything was just regulated by these feedback loops. And this was J. Forrester, and then the Odom brothers. They were doing the system analysis with circuits. So they're trying to show how energy would move through the system overall. Another key figure that came out was Garrett Hardin and his tragedy of the commons. So he talked about this idea that if people were involved, they would seek to maximize their own utility and degrade common pool resources in the absence of any strict oversight or laws that would be imposed upon them to, in other words, people would not control their own use of resources that were in the commons. And of course, this is a lot of these ideas have been critiqued but they still remain in popular conceptions of the environment today. One of the authors that I really like is Wolfgang Sachs, and he talks about these different perspectives. So if we're thinking about things like global environmentalism and how the Earth, how to potentially address some of the issues that we are facing, some of the challenges, and certainly in Koshrai, we could talk about issues of pollution, contamination, and climate change, saltwater intrusion, storm surges, these sorts of things that are potentially compromising the lifeways of people, as well as their homes. So, of course, this is an issue that you might choose to talk about with guests as well. And it really is a matter of how things are framed. So Wolfgang Sachs came up with these, basically looked at these three different ways of how we think about environmental issues. And the first one is essentially market-based. So, this is the cap and trade system of climate change. Pollute, you pay to pollute. Then that's what he refers to as the contest perspective. Global North to invest in the global South. And sustainability and development is simply development that lasts. The astronaut's perspective, these are scientists, mostly in Western settings, basically managing Earth as a whole, spaceship Earth, and that the North's responsibility, again, is to care for all of the Earth. The home perspective looks at local livelihoods and considers the crisis of justice and indeed the resistance against development. And I think that these are interesting, sort of just maybe keep in the background as you're seeing tourists and you're thinking about what they're saying and maybe why they're sharing particular perspectives. Some of the things that, of course, have happened with industrialization is that we see the impacts of climate change in places like Shishmaruk, Alaska, and indeed Alaska. Even you look at Alaska maybe on a map and you're like, oh, wow, that's super remote. But there's also issues of contamination, bioaccumulation of heavy metals and subsistence food in Alaska. Resource scarcity, so fighting over resources, so these water wars. The zone of hypoxia in the Mississippi with industrial agricultural production, and then the prevalence of chemicals in the environment and the impacts that this has had both on people and also non-human animals as well. So in terms of disaster, I mean, these things are all sort of just happening in the background, and then you have these bigger events. Right, so then that potentially lead you to rethink some things. I mean, we might think about COVID-19 pandemic in light of these types of like a larger event and thinking about things overall. In the United States, one of the real turning points with pollution was the Cayuga River fire in Ohio that actually caught on fire twice, 1952 and 1969. In the latter time period, Time magazine actually published a photo from the 1952 Cayuga River fire. So this was a photo whose time had come. The Centralia fire in Pennsylvania, which is a short 15 miles from my house, just burned underground. Thought that it might still be burning underground. It's basically coal seam that just caught fire. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the Prince of William Sound with the Exxon Valdez, the impacts of Hurricane Katrina, and then again in the same region, the Deepwater Horizon. So these number of disasters have occurred as well. And so a lot of these things really, the Cayuga River fire, the environmental movement, you see a lot of environmental legislation come out in the late 60s and early 1970s, and then more of the international instruments being developed as well. Of course, these laws and these policies were developing in other countries as well. in differing ways. The point that I really want to focus in on is the Wilderness Act of 1964. And so President Johnson in 64 signed the Wilderness Act. And on signing this, he said, if future generations are to remember us with gratitude rather than contempt, we must leave them a glimpse of the world as it was in the beginning, not just after we got through with it. And so the Wilderness Act of 1964 states that a wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And so this really helps to shape how parks are looked at, and how areas are protected, and the impacts of that have been documented by geographers, anthropologists, and others. One of the articles that I really like that highlights some of this is Bleal Butt's work on the safari, and he looks at the Masai Mara Reserve. And so when tourists from Europe and the United States want to go to Africa, they want to see these charismatic megafauna, these really cool big animals. They go out on safari, and they go on these little vans, and hopefully the cheetah doesn't come up and come next to them. Maybe check it out on YouTube. The guy with the cheetah behind him, he's videoing it. It's pretty good. But anyway, so tourists expect to see this, and then they get to the reserve and they see Maasai grazing their cattle. And so the tourists have this particular idea in mind about what wilderness looks like, about what a park should look like. Maybe they see cattle at home, and they don't necessarily want to see cattle when they're, paying lots of money to go. So they have certain expectations. And Bleal Butt talks about what happens when the tourists complain. Essentially, the park rangers get involved, and the Maasai have basically been punished. They've had their cattle confiscated. They've, I believe, been jailed. They've been physically abused. And so, this raises real questions for me, at least, of, what these wilderness areas are and what they're for, and how they're thought about. And the balancing out of making a living in an area. And the interesting part about the Masai Mara Reserve is it was actually created in part through the Maasai grazing their cattle there. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit from these ideas of perception, let's talk a little bit about trail maintenance and repair. So as a tour guide, you're not, going to be going out there with power tools and guiding tourists. I think that would be maybe an extreme tourist adventure, and I don't know, maybe that's a niche market down the road for Koshrai, but it's more likely that you'll have a machete or some other hand tool, and maybe do some light maintenance, cutting back some brush to allow visitors to be able to work their way up or down the trail safely. Making this a little bit more accessible, less challenging, who might not have had the same hiking experiences before. So some general safety rules when using hand tools, and this comes from the U.S. Forest Service, USDA, U.S. Forest Service, Hand Tools for Trail Work 2005. So survey the hazards that are present surrounding each task, use proper personal protective devices like hard hats, gloves, safety glasses, take the right tools for the job. So, gloves, glasses, these types of things, maybe, a hat or a harder brimmed hat, if you're using a machete, might help out. Carefully inspect the condition of the tools before you use them. Make sure the handles are sound, smooth, straight. The heads are tight and the cutting edges are sharp, right? A good tool is one that works, and a bad tool is one that could potentially hurt you or a guest. Some tips for that: avoid transporting tools loose in vehicles. Use toolboxes or otherwise put them in sheets, especially the sharp cutting edges, machetes and sheets. Load and unload tools with care. Always use gloves. Pass tools to others to avoid grasping the cutting edge. Never throw a tool. be aware of nearby workers and visitors as well. And I mean, all of these things are written out because, at some point somebody did that and hurt somebody else. On the trail, carry tools by holding them at your side and downhill with the blades forward and the handles behind. If you should slip, drop the tool to the side to prevent falling on the blade. Designate a central drop point for tools, maybe if you were working in a group with other tour guides near the work site, so tools are less likely to be lost. Mark the handles with a small strip of bright orange paint for visibility. At the day's end, identify tools that need maintenance and schedule time for repairing or replacing tools. And I would, also say that you would want to apply that to your 10 essentials, right? If you have a flashlight, make sure that has newer batteries in it. Make sure it's working properly. If you have water filtration devices, check your equipment. Maybe you have a pocket knife or something like that you utilize, or another type of knife. Make sure that's sharp. Just being prepared, having the right tool, properly working for the job. So this section is we basically looked at environmentalism and what that means, and how folks are going to look at that differently depending on where they're from and their cultural background, also the political background. And this really shapes expectations of looking at places like MCA. But as a tour guide, of course, you can help to shape the discussion about the importance of MCA for Koshrayan livelihoods, for health of the reef, the mangroves, the fisheries as well, drinking water and other things as well. And then we talked also a little bit about trail maintenance and safety. So take some time here to think about what we talked about, what I talked about, and based on your notes in the tour guide training manual, what resource management ideas might visitors bring with them to Koshrai, and how would you respond to those ideas? And as a tour guide in the MCA, what can you do to help to maintain the trails in the MCA, maybe making life a little bit easier for the next tour guide? Maybe it's even you on that trail next time. So just some questions to think about, so spend some time and write that out. And yeah, thank you very much.